r/nosleep. Posted by NewAgeSolution. I'm a home care nurse, the 7 rules for Mr. Tweague's house. For me, it was about finding the right fit when it came to a job. 18 months after leaving the military, where I worked as a field medic, I had already been through 4 different jobs and wound up quitting every single one. A few weeks after leaving my last position, a home care agency reached out to me about an opening for a night nurse at the home of a longtime patient. The prospect of working a night shift and simplicity of focusing on a single individual was appealing and unique from my previous jobs. I ultimately accepted the position and after 2 weeks of orientation training, was ready to get started. The patient's name was Tweague. He was 104 years old and suffered a stroke about 25 years ago that put him in a catatonic state. He couldn't move or speak and would need to have everything done for him, from nourishment to bathing and transportation. Apparently, he was a very wealthy man and lived in a large house, where he wanted to remain in lieu of being transferred to a medical care facility. Aside from my full-time work, I like to write and keep journals. The following entries recount my first night working at Mr. Tweague's home. 8:41 p.m. I arrived at the Tweague residence at 7:50 p.m. I pulled up in the circular driveway and noticed the lights were on inside the giant white brick house, but didn't see any other cars. When I spoke to Mrs. Bowe, the care team's head nurse, she clarified I would be alone upon arrival but would have instructions left for me. At the front entrance, I found an envelope with Madeline written on it, my first name. The envelope contained the following letter. Greetings Ms. Burrows. Welcome to the residence of Mr. Tweague. We are pleased to have you join our little family. Your shift begins at 8 p.m. sharp. You will be relieved at 5:30 a.m. When you arrive, Mr. Tweague will have already been fed, bathed and ready for bed. He has a very simple routine. Upon arrival, Mr. Tweague will be in the parlor listening to the radio. The dial will be set to AM frequency 101.3. Do not change it. He will stay in the parlor until 8:45 p.m. Move Mr. Tweague to his study from 8:45 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. He likes listening to his audio tapes. Follow the instructions on what tape to play for him that night. At 9 p.m., make sure all windows and doors leading outside are locked. Mr. Tweague goes to bed at 9:30 p.m. Use the service elevator by the stairway to transport him upstairs. Set his hospital bed at a 25-degree angle. While Mr. Tweague is asleep, make sure his bedroom door is shut at all times and check in on him every 30 to 45 minutes. In addition, you must follow these 7 important rules. 1. There are 9 mirrors in the house. After you put Mr. Tweague to bed, cover every mirror with a white sheet. 2. You may find Mr. Tweague out of his room after you've put him to bed. If this happens, bring him back to his bedroom and lock the door. 3. If you receive a call on the landline from 10:45 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., the caller will have a message for Mr. Tweague. Write it down on the notepad and follow any specific instructions they may give you. 4. From 1:09 a.m. to 1:51 a.m., stay in Mr. Tweague's bedroom with the door locked. Otherwise, crawl on all fours if you fail to reach his room before that time. It can't see anything lower than 3 feet from the ground. If it comes near you, don't look up. 5. The mannequins in Mr. Tweague's study like to roam the house after midnight. If you ever find both in the same place, disarm the mannequins and cover them with white sheets. 6. Inside the refrigerator is a lidded pot. At 2:59 a.m., set the pot on the top stair leading into the basement. Return for the pot at 3:37 a.m. and put it in the sink. Do not enter the basement under any circumstances. 7. If you hear the radio or television turn on, stop what you're doing and move to the second floor immediately. Remain there until it is quiet downstairs. Help yourself to any food or drinks in the kitchen. You may use the television in the den, radio in the parlor, or computer in the study and are free to explore the house. Contact the agency's 24-hour line if you need anything. Mrs. Bowe, head nurse. Mr. Tweague was in the parlor, just as the letter said. He was very frail and had a deathly pale, narrow, wrinkled face with dark circles under his sunken eyes and thin arch of scraggly grayish-white hair lining the sides of his bald scalp. He was wearing a plaid wool robe and had another blanket tightly wrapped around his legs. His wheelchair was state-of-the-art, able to recline, move vertically up and down and even had smaller gadgets attached that were monitoring his vitals. While Mr. Tweague's appearance was somewhat unsettling, I did empathize and treated him like any ordinary patient. With a smile, I introduced myself to Mr. Tweague and explained what I would be doing. As expected, Mr. Tweague didn't respond and simply stared straight ahead with his rigid, stony, expressionless look on his face. The radio emitted bursts of static with gargled voices that were uttering indecipherable words and phrases. I double-checked the dial to see it was indeed set at AM 101.3, remembering how I was instructed not to change the channel. I just finished my walkthrough of the house and found additional instructions on where the medical supplies were located, how to operate the service elevator, locations of every door, window and mirror, along with a set of numbered keys and reference for the use of each one. It's time to bring Mr. Tweague to his study. 10:04 p.m. It took some time, but I just finished covering all the mirrors and am about to make a final sweep of all the windows and doors to make sure they're locked. I completed the rest of Mr. Tweague's routine without incident. The instructions in his study told me to play an audio tape on his cassette player labeled AF029. I put headphones on Mr. Tweague, so I couldn't hear what he was listening to, but could tell by the expression in his eyes he was fully engaged. The mannequins mentioned in Rule 5 were on either side of the bookshelf in his study. They were whitish-beige and seemed to embody the female form with completely featureless faces. One had its hand placed on its hip while the other hand's fingers lightly grasped the bottom of its chin as if the mannequin was in a state of thought. The other mannequin's hands were intertwined behind its head and it stood in a coy, compelling pose. Both stood on their own platforms and had the words Ada and Nina written on each, which I guessed were their names. I noticed Ada had a crack running down the center of its face, while Nina was missing its left index and pinky fingers. I jokingly introduced myself and even asked them not sneak up on me, since I scared easily. The house's rules are quite peculiar the more I think about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are part of an indoctrination joke they pull on newcomers. I'm anxious to learn more when I speak with Mrs. Bow, who's worked for Mr. Tweague since before he got sick. I'm sure she knows everything there is about his past in this house. 10:49 p.m. I thought I heard giggling or crying. I couldn't tell which it was. It seemed like it was coming from the walls. I heard it in the kitchen, living room, den and upstairs hallway. It would appear and fade randomly. I may have just been hearing things. It is an old house after all. 12:06 a.m. About an hour ago, I received a strange phone call on the house's landline. I probably shouldn't feel this way, since Rule 3 mentioned this might happen. When I answered, there was a lot of static on the other end, eerily similar to the radio station Mr. Tweague was listening to in the parlor. After asking who it was, a deep raspy male voice with an unidentifiable accent told me to let Mr. Tweague know that everything was going according to plan in somewhat of a sinister taunting tone. He then told me to open the basement door and relay the same message from the top of the stairs. The most unnerving part about the call was whoever I spoke with addressed me by my first name. This really threw me off guard, but I rationalized that Mrs. Bow probably told him who I was at some point. Nonetheless, I couldn't shake off how unsettled the conversation left me, and it only got worse when I followed the man's instructions. When I opened the basement door, it revealed a decrepit wooden staircase that seemed to lead into a pit of impenetrable blackness. Intimidated by the sight, I nervously uttered the message that everything was going according to plan and wasn't sure if I was supposed to wait for some kind of response. After about 20 seconds, a cold dry breeze flowed up from the basement, sending chills down my spine and made the hairs on my arms stand. That was more than enough for me to shut the door. 12:19 a.m. I keep hearing scratching noises. They're coming from the floor. I think Mr. Tweague hears them as well. 12:41 a.m. I can't explain what just happened to me. I did another check on Mr. Tweague, and when I was walking down the stairs, I felt this concentrated burning across my forehead. It was brief, but so sharp and intense I almost tumbled down the stairs. I swiped the area with my fingers, which to my horror, were covered in blood. I ran to the bathroom and tore off the sheet covering the mirror. I had a cut running diagonally down the left side of my forehead, from where blood was streaking down my face. Pressing some tissues over the cut, I opened the mirror and checked the medicine cabinet for band-aids. I found one, but as I closed the cabinet and glanced in the mirror, I caught the parting trails of someone in a white dress or gown gliding down the hall. I quickly spun 180 degrees and remained frozen in place for a good 5 minutes. After nothing happened, I convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. I applied the band-aid to my forehead and put the white sheet back on the mirror. Some of the blood I wiped off my forehead had gotten on the sheet. I was alarmed at first, but remembered reading in the instructions there were extra white sheets in the linen closet on the second floor. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I screamed at the top of my lungs and almost fell backward when I was greeted by the sight of Mr. Tweague sitting in his wheelchair. The old man was hunched forward, his withered head hanging and arms dangling at his side like he was ashamed of being found. I hastily returned him to bed and locked the bedroom door, remembering the instructions from Rule 2. Maybe it's the solitude or first day jitters, but I'm starting to have my doubts about working at this place. I have no idea how I got that cut on my forehead, and after that experience with Mr. Tweague, I'm very tempted to just get up and leave. The thought of leaving Mr. Tweague alone, however, is what's ultimately forcing me to stay. 1:03 a.m. After my spontaneous bleeding episode, I've been in the study to try and calm my nerves by listening to some music and check my social media pages. I was distracted by one of the desk drawers being partly open, and being the compulsive person that I am, tried shutting it, but realized it was stuck. When I pulled out the drawer to flatten everything inside, a white manila folder caught my eye. I'm normally not an intrusive person, but my curiosity got the best of me when I saw case B071 and a red X written on the label. The folder contained a cluster of papers, with the top one being a file on a young girl, whose name was blacked out. The file appeared to be some sort of medical report and dated back to 1984. There were some notes jotted under a box labeled symptoms, which made me extremely uneasy as I read through them. Skin discoloration now at 80%. Exhibiting extreme human strength, leather restraints starting to give. Screams breaching soundproof barriers. Increased tranquilizer dosage proving ineffective. Another box labeled notes read: approaching 180 days. Condition is worsening. Is now completely despondent. Parents are growing impatient and demanding answers. Running out of options. Might have to call in friends from the city, but it might be too late. Ease conditions for release are ludicrous and damning, but we might not have any other choice. That was as far as I read, when I realized something in the corner of my eye and completely froze. The mannequins were gone. 1:57 a.m. I don't know what to do. I'm too afraid to leave Mr. Tweague's bedroom. I went downstairs and got a soda from the fridge. When I turned around, my eyes were inches away from the tip of a kitchen knife, held by one of the mannequins. It was Ada, who I recognized from the crack running down its face. It now held a knife in one arm, raised in a stabbing gesture, its plaster fingers tightly clenching the handle. Behind it was Nina, who brandished a meat cleaver in one hand and bread knife in the other. I thought if I so much as budged, the mannequin would jam the knife through my eye, but it didn't. I remembered Rule 5 after what felt like an eternity and tiptoed around the mannequins, before bolting upstairs to the linen closet. I retrieved 2 white sheets, but when I returned to the kitchen, they were gone. Was I supposed to disarm them first? Where are they now? It was then I realized I had broken another rule earlier that night. I forgot to write the caller's message down for Mr. Tweague. I didn't even have time to react to the panic that ensued. All the lights in the house went out. After a few seconds, I started hearing this rhythmic thump, immediately followed by a slow, heavy scraping. Whatever was making that noise appeared to be heading toward the kitchen. I was too afraid to budge at first, until my eyes drifted toward the stove clock's glowing numbers, which read 1:09 a.m. I instinctively collapsed onto the floor and kept my head down. Trying to repress my whimpers and sniffles, I slowly crawled out of the kitchen toward the stairs. All I had to do was stay low, ascend the stairs and make it to Mr. Tweague's bedroom. The last thought I had was at least Mr. Tweague's bedroom was locked and he was safe, before I heard the continuous thumping and scraping come from behind me. I saw a pair of large, light bluish-gray feet appear next to me. One foot made a loud thump, while the other, which looked unnaturally distorted and swollen, dragged behind and made the teeth-grinding scraping noise. Why, did I look up? 2:44 a.m. Mr. Tweague was sitting upright in bed. His mouth was hanging wide open, like he was frozen mid-scream. He was cold to the touch. When I tried to lay him back down, he was extremely rigid and wouldn't budge. I'm just going to leave him like this. Hopefully he's laying back down when I check on him later. The scratching is coming from the floor again. 3:16 a.m. It was hard to do without looking up, and I did it 5 minutes later than instructed, but I put the lidded pot in the refrigerator on the top stair leading down into the basement. I locked myself in Mr. Tweague's study and don't even know if I want to go back downstairs. I spotted Ada standing by the coffee table in the parlor while leaving the kitchen. Nina is at the end of the hall. I rummaged through Mr. Tweague's desk and came across a leather-bound journal with Mr. Tweague's name inscribed in gold. Most of it was sloppily written in cursive and difficult to read, but I made out one particular excerpt from an entry dated September 1, 1993. It's funny when you think you're doing something for the greater good that you know is making people and the world a better place. You take the praise and respect you feel entitled to for granted, until you realize you've become bound to exactly what you're fighting. It's ironic that their intended prison has turned into a nurturing ground to make them stronger. Their confines are getting weaker and they sense it. I don't know what I'm going to do. I just heard a loud thump at the door. 4:07 a.m. I don't have the strength to crawl up the stairs. It's hard enough to do without looking up. All I can do is write. I mustered up the courage to retrieve the pot before the deadline. When I opened the basement door, it was no longer on the top stair. Peering down into the dark abyss, I pondered whether I should go down, when the pot flung out of the blackness and hit me directly in the knee. I fell to the floor and started tumbling down the basement stairs. The inside of the pot was coated in a thick red ooze that smelled like smoky rotting meat. Some of it got on me. It was when I started frantically scrambling up the stairs the screams started, a symphony of shrieks and bellows containing tones of agony, sadness, terror and rage. I reached the top stair when I felt something sharp grab onto my injured leg, like claws digging into my flesh as it tried pulling me down. I used every last ounce of strength to release my leg, too frightened to look down at whatever had grabbed a hold of me. I heard something make its way up the stairs toward me when I slammed the door shut. Whatever it was started pounding on the basement door when it reached the top of the stairs. I heard a few short bursts of hissing and series of low scratching and scraping noises, which ceased after 10 or 15 seconds. I'm pretty sure my kneecap is shattered and the lower half of my shin is covered in deep slash marks that formed a steady smeary blood trail behind me. The pain is unbearable. I'm hoping if I lay here, I can eventually drift off and be discovered by the first arriving member of the daycare team at 5:30 a.m. Or not. I just heard the television turn on in the den. Posted by NewAgeSolution. My son brought a human head for show and tell. The call took me totally off guard. Mrs. Fiora, can you please come to the school as soon as possible? Mrs. Morgan, the school's guidance counselor asked. Julian isn't hurt, but he's in a very serious situation. When I asked what happened, Mrs. Morgan said it'd be better to explain when I arrived. Bewildered and unnerved, I feared the worst when speculating what my 8-year-old son might have done. Julian could sometimes be a bit unruly at home, but never once got in any trouble at school. Julian's teachers loved him, and he appeared to get along with all his classmates, which made this so unusual. Despite pondering every conceivable scenario during the drive, I never would have guessed what my son ultimately did in a million years. My stomach sank when I saw an ambulance and trio of police cruisers in front of the school. After parking in the visitor's lot, I was greeted by Mrs. Morgan, Mr. Quattro, Julian's teacher, Mrs. Jones, the principal, and 2 police officers, one of whom happened to be my cousin Brady. I noticed none of them looked angry. They all had the same disturbed looks of horror and disbelief across their faces. Mrs. Fiora, thank you coming so quickly. Mrs. Jones said. Where's my son? I asked anxiously. What did he do? He's with Mr. Isbister right now, the school psychologist, Mrs. Jones quickly replied. Before I could ask another question, Brady stepped forward and took me aside. Look, they figured it'd be best if I tell you what's going on, so brace yourself, Brady said softly, taking a breath before continuing. Julian brought a head to school, an actual human head. What? Was all I could gasp out, after not saying anything for a few seconds, unsure if I heard Brady correctly. He had it in his backpack. Did you see him leave the house today? I waited with him for the bus like I do every morning, I said, unsure if there was a hint of suspicion in Brady's voice. I had no reason to think anything out of the ordinary was going on. When I asked Brady what exactly happened, he motioned for Mr. Quattro, who slowly walked over to where we stood. Mr. Quattro was still visibly distraught over the incident, as indicated by his trembling hand, which ironically only had 4 fingers, when we briefly exchanged shakes. When Brady asked him to recount what happened, Mr. Quattro swallowed nervously before beginning. The kids were supposed to have show and tell yesterday, but we couldn't get to it in time, so I had them do it today before lunch, Mr. Quattro said, his face contorting with disgust while giving his account. When it was Julian's turn, he said he brought in a special friend. He just pulled it out of his pack like it was nothing, in front of the whole class. Julian said the head was his, Uncle Milty. Brady added. He doesn't have an Uncle Milty, I said, staring mystified at my cousin. Did he say where he found it? He said the head was growing from the ground in the woods behind your house. My blood ran cold and mine started racing. I wasn't sure what rattled me more, Julian seeing and physically handling a human head, or the grim prospect that someone's remains were discarded a stone's throw away from where my family slept. Julian wasn't allowed in the woods bordering our backyard unsupervised, and even when permitted, knew he had to stay within view. When could he have made such a gruesome discovery without us knowing? Take me to my son. Julian was playing with Legos in Mr. Isbister's office when I entered, seeming totally unaware of the situation's severity. Mr. Isbister said Julian was immediately brought here, while he and Mr. Quattro tried getting his class under control. When I asked if Julian explained why he did this, Mr. Isbister's answer sent a sharp chill down my spine. He said Uncle Milty told him to. Mr. Isbister let Brady and I speak to Julian alone in his office. My son was elated to see me, and seemed under the impression this was some kind of special occasion. The innocent unsuspecting look in his young face showed Julian appeared unaware he did anything wrong, which for me, made this ordeal extra difficult. "Julian, do you know what's going on?" I asked while sitting him on the couch. "Do you know why we're here right now?" Julian's smile faded when he saw how concerned Brady and I looked. "Julian, who's Uncle Milty?" I asked when my son's eyes started to wander around the office. "You don't have an uncle with that name." "He lived in a hole behind our house," Julian said nonchalantly, appearing more interested in getting back to playing with the Legos. "I'm helping him find a new home." Brady and I looked at each other, both of us visibly perturbed by Julian's answer. "What do you mean, cuz?" Brady quickly asked when he saw I was at a loss for words. "Can you tell me exactly where you found the head, I mean, Uncle Milty?" Julian's smile returned. "I was trying to find a ball I hit really far into the woods, and I found him sticking out of the ground," he replied. I knew the exact day Julian was referring to, this past Saturday afternoon. Julian and my husband were playing baseball, when he hit an absolute howitzer that sailed into the tree line. Although they spread out to find the ball, my husband said Julian was always within view. It took over a half hour for them to find the ball, and I do remember losing sight of them quite a few times during their search. Julian must have found it then, I thought, becoming deeply unsettled when imagining the naive look on his face when he made that grisly discovery. "Would you be able to show us where you found him?" Brady asked. "And did you take Uncle Milty with you the day you find him?" Julian shook his head. "I visited him again before he told me to take him. He lived where the woodpile used to be." Julian was talking about a large mound of firewood in our backyard. It took a few days, but my husband and I relocated all the wood to another part of the yard. Its original location was a few yards into the tree line. We wanted to build a shed there, but wound up finding a better spot, despite clearing the area. I nodded at Brady, indicating I knew the exact place Julian described. "Julian, what do you mean when you said he told you to take him? Who were you talking to?" Brady asked. Julian looked at Brady perplexed. "Uncle Milty. He told me when I could take him with me." "So, you've been talking to this Uncle Milty head? Like how the three of us are talking right now?" I asked, tightly pursing my lips when Julian nodded affirmingly. I don't know what I'd have said if someone told me earlier today my son would bring a human head into school that was also his imaginary friend. Mr. Isbister said Julian may have been severely traumatized by what he found, and imagined it had interactive qualities as a coping mechanism. While Julian was getting looked at by the school nurse, Brady took me to see if I recognized the head's face. The severed head was being kept in an ice-filled cooler out in the ambulance. It was in a large clear evidence bag, and looked to have only died fairly recently. I didn't recognize the man, who appeared to be in his 30s and had a bloated face with narrow cheeks, large black eyes, Roman nose, thick pink lips, and short black hair. His eyes were still open looking in different directions, and mouth hung agape, its tongue partly protruding from between his teeth. The head's whitish-beige skin had patches of mottled skin, darkened veins, and proverbial deathly gray tint synonymous with corpses. I only looked long enough to verify I didn't recognize the man's face, before having to suppress an oncoming urge to vomit. Julian was medically and psychologically evaluated before we were both interviewed by detectives at the police station. We didn't get home until later that night, and by then, a forensics team had already set up shop on my property. Brady kept me informed, and was at my house monitoring the situation. The whole area in front of my home was cordoned off by yellow police tape, and jam-packed with a sundry of police vehicles. Brady and one of the detectives met me at the perimeter. I kept Julian near me while walking up to Brady and the detective, who had me bring my son inside before we spoke. Our cadaver dogs instantly picked up a scent and brought us right to the spot your son mentioned, the detective, whose last name was Vendetto, began. We unearthed a shallow grave containing the remains of a body, a headless body. Despite largely expecting this, hearing someone confirm it was an actual reality made it no easier to accept. There was a corpse buried on my property that nobody probably would have known about had we not moved that heaping wood pile. A decomposing body my son had the misfortune of discovering. No child is ever meant to experience those kinds of realities life offers at such a delicate age. Although Julian's maintained a reserved exterior thus far, I shuddered to think what actual thoughts and impacts this experience was having on my son. If it really was where the old woodpile used to be, which was there before I even bought the house, it had to have been there for a long time, no? I inquired, particularly emphasizing how the woodpile predated when my family lived at the house. Well, that's the thing, Brady replied, getting an approving nod from Detective Vendato to continue. Whoever's head Julian found has probably only been dead for 7 to 10 days tops. The other remains have been buried there for a while, years probably. I squinted in confusion at Brady and the detective. So, they're looking for another body right now? There's 2 out there? Maybe not here, Detective Vendato said. We haven't found any more remains yet, but think someone might have dismembered and dispersed another body, whose head your son found. It didn't make sense. There's no way the head Julian found and decapitated remains they discovered were the same person, but I couldn't chalk up Julian's discovery happening to be in the same exact spot as the other corpse they just found being a coincidence. Without any substantiated proof however, we were only left to speculate. Despite a thorough search of the woods behind my house and surrounding area, no additional human remains were found. Since the body was on our property, we had to be formally cleared of any wrongdoing. While undergoing that process, more peculiar happenings occurred. 2 days after the incident, Brady told me the head Julian found went missing at the police station, seemingly disappearing overnight without a trace. 1 week later, Julian's teacher Mr. Quattro was killed. Only his severed head was discovered. The man's body was never found. My husband and I had kept Julian out of school since that fateful day, and were considering transferring him so he could have a fresh start. Hearing news of his teacher's demise, which I kept away from Julian, prompted us to go through with the move. Even before eventually selling the house, we packed up and relocated to a new town. Julian adjusted well, despite still receiving therapy to help him manage his understanding of what happened, and always speaking of Uncle Milty in high regard if it ever came up in conversation. Our new home was closer to my job, and Julian made friends quickly at his new school. About 3 months passed since his show and tell incident. It was Julian's birthday, who I hadn't gotten a chance to call, since my morning and early afternoon were filled with back-to-back meetings, calls, and appointments. I was already behind schedule, and putting the final touches on a report that was 15 minutes past due. I heard my office door open, which I knew was my final appointment before lunch. Keeping my eyes glued to the computer screen, I told my client to sit tight for 5 minutes, determined to have this write-up finished and sent before shifting gears. I heard him mutter something under his breath in a disgruntled tone, before walking up to one of the chairs in front of my desk. While finishing the report, I pulled up my calendar to view my meeting's details, since my assistant made some last-minute changes to my morning schedule, and failed to specify what they were before going to lunch. Soon as the appointment opened on my screen however, I heard the abrupt footsteps of the client walking toward the door. I am so sorry about that. I didn't mean to be rude, worried my inattentiveness may have rubbed him the wrong way. I quickly pulled my eyes from the computer screen just as he was about to leave my office. I caught a long enough glimpse to remember his face, long and narrow with beady, sly-looking, black eyes, reddish-pink lips that formed in a half-smirk, a balding forehead, and short dark hair. Adjusting his fleece's dull neck collar, he looked at me with disgust and disappointment before closing the door behind him with his hand. I quickly stood up and tried gesturing for the man to stay, kicking myself for being so inconsiderate, and dreading the possible ramifications of this mishap. He looked oddly familiar, I thought while hurrying across my office. Hoping to catch him, I swung the door open, but he was already gone. Stomping in frustration, I slowly shut the door, thankful my assistant didn't witness that spectacle. Turning back to face my office, I froze after noticing a package on one of the chairs. It was a square box about 14 by 14 and gift-wrapped in plaid red and green paper. There was a card taped on top of the package addressed to my son. Upon reading it, I was hit with a spinning lightheadedness when it made me remember where I previously saw that man's face. Dear Julian, wishing you a happy birthday, as promised. Thank you again for helping me with the new look. Talk soon. You Milty. I stood there holding the card in my shaking hands, constantly rereading the handwritten note inside of it, while trying to comprehend who was just in my office. However, it wasn't his face being that of the severed head Julian found, which filled me with paralyzing terror. The man's hand he used to shut the office door behind him, I realized, only had 4 fingers. Posted by NewAgeSolution. Killing mommy's boyfriend. When Andrea first saw us, it was love at first sight, and the feeling was entirely mutual. We were elated when Andrea adopted us, and seamlessly began referring to her as our mother. She made us feel loved, which is something we've never previously experienced other than among ourselves. Andrea, or Mommy, as we popularly referred to her, gave us new everything: clothes, toys and friends to play with, even our own room in the beautiful condo where we lived. Her friends always made a big fuss over us whenever they visited, complimenting on how cute we looked in our matching outfits. Their favorites were these light orange shirts and dark blue suspenders that had light pink hearts, which displayed our abbreviated names, Andy, Randy, and Sandy. The fact that Mommy made them herself are why those outfits were so meaningful, and made us really excited whenever she picked them out for us to wear. We especially enjoyed when any of Mommy's friends came over with kids our own age. We'd have so much fun spending hours playing games like house and hide and seek, but my favorites were the ones made up on the spot. She'd confide her deepest secrets and lamented about her problems whenever she'd sleep in our room or vice versa, always saying how much it meant for us to just listen. Mommy even took us to her job a few times, where we received nothing but compliments from her co-workers. We grew extremely attached to Andrea during those first few months, and knew Mommy's sentiments were the same. Each of us thought this seemingly unbreakable bond with her would last forever, one that we strongly cherished and were eternally grateful to have. We were Mommy's little angels. For the first time in our young lives, me and my siblings felt like we were part of a true family. That all changed when Mommy started seeing Tim. Apparently, he worked in the same building as Mommy's job, and they would frequently talk if they ever bumped into each other during the workday. Tim was a computer programmer, but his biggest passion was sports, namely the major ones like baseball, hockey, football, and basketball. He was especially into stats and analytics, namely the highly advanced ones, which he used to gauge the value or track progress of a player or team. He wrote for a few different sports blogs, but rarely posted any content. Tim was primarily focused on his social media accounts, where he did have a large following, and engaging in heated discussions, where he tried to prove people wrong and make them see things his way. There's no denying Tim's formidable wealth of knowledge on these topics, but he was a pompous know-it-all and had a monstrous ego. According to Tim, his outlook was the only acceptable way to properly interpret a scenario or back an opinion with facts. As more time passed, I noticed this defective trait of his applied to practically everything he did, in addition to his profound sports analysis. He was constantly correcting or critiquing Mommy on everything, to the point where it was affecting her confidence and overall morale. Tim was a very condescending individual, and seemed to take pleasure at correcting and lecturing Mommy on the right way of doing something, or even how to think. We knew he was ultimately conditioning her to be just like him, and it concerned us when she vented about Tim's overly abrasive and controlling qualities, especially when Mommy became convinced that she actually needed what she called Tim's necessary discipline in her life. Even some of her friends tried advocating for Mommy to break it off with Tim, but she gave them the same bland excuse. "He's good for me," she would always say, sounding like a robotic recording during each instance. "He gives me structure, companionship, and discipline, things I've never had in my life before that I need to become a better person." Tim wasn't a big fan of us either, and seemed quite jealous of the love and attention we got from Mommy. Whenever he would use the computer in our bedroom, Tim would kick us out until he was finished, saying we made him feel uncomfortable, whatever that means. The three of us were powerless to stop Mommy from continuing to see Tim, or at least bring to her attention how toxic his belittling, dominion-seeking personality was becoming. She went from being loving and vivacious to a timid shell of her former self that questioned everything she did and said, especially with Tim. It got worse when Tim started spending nights, which eventually turned into stays lasting weekends, or days at a time. Tim's influence slowly encroached into our home, from how the furniture was arranged, to what foods he wanted Mommy to cook or shows they watched. We grew extremely fed up with Tim's unrelenting impositions and neared our breaking point when Mommy told us that Tim was not only moving in, but wanted to make our room into an office, or as he called it, his analytics station. "Tim's going to become part of our little family," Mommy told us one night with a tone of blatantly forced enthusiasm in her voice. "We'll be more complete now than we were before." We brandished our smiles when Mommy relayed us the news, but were boiling with anger and concern on the inside. All three of us could tell just by looking in Mommy's eyes that deep down, she didn't want Tim moving into our home. Their relationship took such a toll on her that Mommy genuinely felt she actually needed Tim to function in all aspects in life. We decided to act when he brutally berated Mommy one night, after she reorganized the linen closet. but missed one minor detail among Tim's specific convoluted instructions. She locked herself in our room, where we tried soothing her as she held us tightly, during which Tim continued lecturing her from the other side of the door. What repulsed me the most were the petty apology acts Tim would pull whenever they fought that one mommy over, every single time. He was breaking our mommy if she wasn't already in shambles. Considering how warm, giving, and personable mommy was, seeing her treated this way, while those lovable aspects about her slowly deteriorated, was overwhelmingly objectionable. That was when we decided to get rid of Tim by any means necessary. All we needed was for him to give us an opening. Me and my siblings formulated a plan and gathered the materials we needed for its implementation: a roller skate, from mommy's days playing roller hockey, and kitchen knife. All we had to do then, was wait for our chance. It came one day when mommy left to run some errands, after quadruple checking with Tim that everything she had listed was accurate. Once she left, Tim put some boxes of his belongings into our room, and smirked as he walked up to the three of us. "Enjoy it while it's still yours. By the month's end, this room is going to be my domain," Tim said arrogantly, his face scrunching when he put a special emphasis on the word "my" as he spoke in his deep nasally voice. "You'll be more out of the way, wherever I wind up putting you three." Everything about Tim was always excruciatingly unbearable at that moment. It took every ounce of self-restraint I had from smashing that enormous beak-like nose. Just looking at Tim sent my mind into a frenzy. He had this thin face with a curved narrow chin, large cheekbones, and massive nose that seemed 2 sizes too big for his head. He wore black framed glasses over his small light green eyes, always had some sort of sports hat covering his short dark grayish-brown hair, and had this exasperating habit of constantly keeping his mouth slightly parted, revealing his rows of yellowish-white teeth. Simply put, he had an extraordinarily punchable face. One I spent nights on end pondering how someone as smart and bright as mommy could have taken such a liking. With a slight snort, Tim laughed at his own words as he left our room and sat in the den. Our bedroom was located directly across, which gave us a clear view of Tim. He kept flipping between a few different games and frantically typing on his laptop, most likely making a slew of social media posts that coincided with whatever he was watching. Tim was consumed with his pretend life as a wannabe pro sports analyst, so we knew he wouldn't notice when we dispersed to put our plan into motion. While Sandra entered the kitchen to make the distraction, I retrieved the knife we previously concealed in between the mattress and box spring. Randall took the roller skate and hid in the hallway closet, which was about halfway between the den and kitchen. I remained in the bedroom, and would emerge when Tim responded to the impending crash. Sandra did just what she promised, and pushed over the glass vase sitting on the kitchen table. It made a loud shatter that instantly got Tim's attention, who shot upright and asked what the fuck that sound was, out loud to himself. Soon as he walked past our bedroom, I stepped out into the hallway tightly clutching the knife, making sure to remain roughly 70 or so inches behind Tim, his approximate height. My footsteps were very quiet and calculated, so Tim was totally unaware I was trailing closely behind. I managed to keep up with his hasty urgent steps, but started getting nervous, thinking Tim might reach the kitchen before Sandra could get into position. Fortunately, Sandra, being the reliable individual she was, had gotten ready in time. Tim was 3 or 4 feet from the kitchen entrance when Sandra stepped into view, causing him to freeze mid-step. "What?" was all Tim could say as he exchanged stares with Sandra, who wore a widened smile and slowly canted her head while she started waving at Tim. Looking like he knew something was amiss, he slowly started backing up, making sure not to take his eyes off Sandra. Tim was so focused on her, he didn't even notice the closet door nudge open wide enough for Randall to push out the roller skate, which slid directly into his path. Tim released a fearful yelp-like shriek upon tripping over the roller skate. The foot stepping on it shot out forward while the rest of his body jerked back, causing him to immediately lose his balance. Twisting 180 degrees as he fell, I still maintained that precise distance behind Tim, and firmly held the kitchen knife vertically in place, with its pointed blade aimed toward the ceiling. My precision was on point. The knife's entire blade and part of its handle effortlessly sank through Tim's left eye, its serrated tip bursting through the back of his head. A loud smack-like crunch signified the impact his face made when it slammed onto the floor. All was silent after that as we gathered around Tim's stiff twitching body, watching the blood seep out from under his butchered face and collect around his head. The most gratifying part for me, aside from how enormously successful we were at pulling this off, was the monstrosity of a nose Tim had got absolutely smashed during the fall. It looked like a crumpled bloodied accordion tightly wedged between his face and the floor. Mommy reacted exactly how we expected when she returned home. After a spree of incessant frantic hollering and wailing, She broke into hysterics and just barely managed to hold it together enough when she called 911. The police and paramedics arrived quickly, along with Mommy's parents and some of her friends. She was severely traumatized by the incident and completely inconsolable, although part of me thinks some of those tears were of relief that she was out of Tim's shadow, possibly joy. She eventually came in our room to step away from the commotion and hugged us tightly. In between her soft sobs and sniffles, Mommy kept mumbling about how she couldn't and didn't want to believe this was happening. 2 police officers, an older and younger one, entered the bedroom, saying they were ready for Mommy to make her statement. Still sobbing, we watched her step back into the hallway with the older police officer. It truly hurt to see Mommy like this, and we felt absolutely horrible for doing what we did, but knew it was for the best. Tim was slowly eating away at Mommy from the inside, and making her a totally different person. Even if she tried ending things herself, Tim would probably find a way to twist her words and turn the tables, or convince Mommy that's not what she actually wanted. The pain was fresh now, but we knew she would heal quickly. Mommy was a strong person, and we hoped she'd rejoice at the aspect of things going back to normal with our little family. The younger police officer stayed in the room and was staring at us intently, while me and my siblings sat on the bed. He seemed fixated on a particular detail about us and had a growingly suspicious look in his eye that made me extremely uneasy, which was something I thought he sensed. "What the hell are you still doing in here?" the older police officer, who walked out with Mommy, asked as he re-entered the room. The younger police officer continued watching us closely for a couple more seconds before replying. "Doesn't something just seem off about them?" he asked softly. I tensed sharply. "What are you talking about?" the older police officer asked out loud, seeming irritated at what his colleague was saying. "I don't know," the young officer said, squinting as he leaned in closer, making me increasingly convinced we were about to be compromised. "I can't quite put my finger on it." The older officer looked like he quickly ran out of patience and hastily started guiding the younger officer back towards the door, which filled me with relief. I nearly chuckled when I heard what the older police officer said to his younger colleague as they left the room. "Well, there's plenty to do out here that you can put your finger on. I'm not sure what you found so fascinating about them. They're just dolls." Posted by NewAgeSolution. Journal entries from a plane crash survivor lost at sea. My brother works for the Coast Guard. A few months ago, I was helping him move, and came across a yellow bottle stuffed with old worn-out papers. After sorting through them, I realized they were journal entries. Many of them were unreadable, partially torn, or covered in dark stains and smears, but the ones I could decipher told an extraordinary story. My brother said he found the bottle about a year ago, while out on patrol. It was in an empty, partially deflated draft. I don't know what to make of these entries, or what happened to the people mentioned, but feel like their story should be shared. I've translated them to the best of my ability. July 19th. We're probably the only ones left. The plane had 20 rows that respectively sat 2 on one side, and 3 on the other, so 100 in total. It was a full flight. The plane had 2 pilots and 3 flight attendants, so that brings the number up to 105. 105 unsuspecting souls. We were flying over the Atlantic during a fierce storm when it happened. I don't know what caused it, but the plane started shaking violently, before going into a freefall. The pilots managed to regain control of the craft and made a rough landing. Only less than half of everyone on board got onto the rafts before a large wave sank the plane. Whoever wasn't on those rafts didn't stand a chance. I don't know how we got through that night. I was lucky enough to be one of the first that got onto the rafts. There were at least a dozen others in mine before the plane sank, but after hours of getting tossed and turned by that violent storm, only 5 of us remained. We must be miles away from land because we can't see any in sight. I don't know how my journal managed to survive that whole ordeal without getting lost or damaged. Perhaps I meant to record everything that happens while we're adrift, waiting to be rescued. I guess everyone's still trying to process these last 12 hours. Nobody's said a word. July 20th. We found 2 more floating in the ocean, clinging onto a seat cushion. Our group total is now 7. It seems that rescuing these 2 kickstarted us to start proactively assessing our situation. We don't have much in terms of supplies: 4 water bottles, some toiletries, 1 first aid kit, 2 seat cushions, and a plastic briefcase container. We all have scrapes, bumps, bruises, and sunburns, but one woman named Norma is in especially bad shape. She has a nasty head wound, and fractured her left tibia. The fractured end of her bone was protruding from her skin, and had to be pushed back in by Kim, one of the survivors on this raft who's an EMT. Norma's injuries look infected. She's been going in and out of consciousness all day. Kim is concerned. The other two are named Jordan and Elliot. Not too sure what either of them do for a living. Incidentally, Elliot actually sat next to me on the plane. The two we just saved are Oliver and Isabel. They're both grad students, who recently got engaged. Oliver said they got out of the plane right before it sank. Everything else afterwards was a blur. Oliver doesn't know how they survived the storm, or didn't get separated. It's quite remarkable. We're being carried by a wind coming from the northwest. I don't know if that's good or bad, if it's pushing us closer or further from land. The rest is illegible. July 21st. I awoke first this morning. To my dismay, there was no land in sight. An eerie mist hung in the air, limiting how far I could see, but the sun was beginning to rise. There was no breeze. The raft wasn't moving. I couldn't hear a sound, and was smothered by an unshakable sense of being watched. The morning haze eventually burned off, and although I could see much further, there were still no signs of land. As I sighed and glanced longingly at the featureless horizon, I spotted a peculiar shape protruding from the water in my peripherals. It was about 10 to 15 yards from the raft. At first, all I could make out was a dark grayish-green shape. It looked inanimate, was egg-shaped and about the size of a soccer ball. I thought it was a piece of plane debris. Then it blinked. That's when I spotted two pale yellow eyes. They emitted a piercing stare through a thick veil of what looked like scraggly, matted, dark gray hair. I thought it was the remains of a crash victim, but remains don't blink, I remember thinking. Those glistening yellow eyes blinked a second time, before the figure quickly disappeared below the surface. It happened in a span of 1 to 2 seconds. I don't know what I saw this morning, but it was definitely real because the water rippled around the spot where it submerged. I waited and waited, but the figure never resurfaced. We're hungry. So hungry. Jordan crafted a makeshift fishing line with some thread and a needle from the first aid kit. I later learned he used a piece of flesh from the infected area around Norma's head wound as bait. Jordan's been at it for hours, but hasn't had any luck. That feeling of being watched hasn't ceased. I think the others sense it too, I could tell by their body language. July 23rd. Norma's dead. We don't know when she took her last breath. She could have been gone longer than we realized. Most disturbingly, Norma died open-eyed. Her skin has a sickly blotchy tint that's greenish-gray in color. It reminds me of that figure I spotted the other day. Nonetheless, we're relieved Norma's out of pain. There was nothing we could do for her, and she'd been suffering. She took up a lot of Kim's time, who hasn't said much since declaring her dead. We have her body curled up in a corner, covered with a blanket. We're contemplating whether we should throw the corpse overboard, or hold onto it, in case we get rescued. July 25th. We saw a ship today, but it was too far away, and didn't notice our raft. It was a dark and gloomy day anyway, with sporadic rain, so there was no way we would have been spotted. Fortunately, we're drifting in the same direction as that ship, so hopefully we're on some sort of travel route. Jordan still hasn't caught a fish, but he's determined. He spends all day and night jigging, sometimes staring at the spot he's doing it in for hours. He stopped using bait and crafted a makeshift lure, but it hasn't gotten him any bites. July 26th. We've been adrift for a week. Jordan still hasn't caught any fish, and there continue to be no signs of land. Just the featureless dark blue ocean horizon. It's been so long since we last ate. We were so hungry, and, I can't stress this enough, that's the only reason why we did what I'm about to recount. We decided to throw Norma's body overboard, but not entirely. Kim and Elliot, they cut off pieces of the corpse. Mostly strips of flesh from her calves and arms. They got Norma's body off the raft before making their cuts. I couldn't see, but heard them conduct the gruesome procedure. I tried preoccupying myself by tending to Isabel, who became hysterical upon realizing what they were doing. Oliver and I tried explaining to Isabel that we had no other choice, but she was inconsolable. They soaked the flesh strips in seawater to clean them, and remarkably, barely got any blood in the raft. Jordan refused to partake, saying he'll eat what he catches, and that he only used her as bait. We tenderized the meat, and cut some into bite-sized cubes. We had nothing to make a fire, and ate it raw. I won't describe how it tasted. I just won't. Everyone but Jordan and Isabel ate the meat. Isabel had her face buried while curled up in a corner, screaming and sobbing as we ate. Jordan paid no mind, and spent the whole time trying to catch a fish. July 27th. The first 2 paragraphs are illegible. Seems like she kept writing and crossing out the same sentence. I just don't understand. Nobody understands. Norma. She's back. Her body, Norma's body. It reappeared. Back on the raft. Yesterday, we watched her body float away from the raft, and disappear into the horizon. That awful sight was the first thing my eyes saw when I woke up this morning. My screams woke everyone else up, and I almost fell off the raft scrambling away from Norma's corpse. Norma was clothed when Kim and Elliot threw her overboard. Now, her bloated body was completely naked. Her skin was covered in ghostly pale and bruise-colored blotches. Her stiff limbs were bent backwards or twisted in some disturbingly unnatural position. The missing strips of skin and flesh that Kim and Elliot cut off were glaringly apparent. She looked extremely decomposed, like she's been dead for weeks and not days. That wasn't even the worst part. It was her face. Her horrible, wretched face. Norma's cloudy bloodshot eyes were wide open, and practically bulged out of their sockets. Her mouth hung agape, appearing to be permanently frozen mid-scream. Norma's face didn't look like that when she died. Her eyes were closed, and although her jaw was still parted, it nowhere near resembled its current appearance. There was something else about her head. I forgot to mention. It was twisted completely around, 180 degrees. We're all huddled on one side of the raft. Everyone's afraid to go near the corpse, so we're just sitting here, getting pierced by her twisted manic stare. Everyone except Jordan, who's been trying to catch a fish all this time. July 29th. Isabel's shrill screams woke me up this morning. I first realized that a thin coating of blood covered the entire bottom of our raft. We all must have slept in for who knows how long. Kim and Oliver tried restraining Isabel, who was absolutely hysterical. Completely far gone. Elliot and I looked on in sheer horror at the unsettling sight that set off Isabel. Norma's body, arms, were tightly weaved into the raft's elastic cables as if to hold it in place. She was missing her lower right leg, and had a large vertical gash running down her backside. Blood still seeped from the massive opening. I quickly realized her spine was missing. That's when I spotted Jordan. He sat on the raft's edge, grasping Norma's bloodied spine in his hands. My stomach knotted upon realizing that Jordan fashioned Norma's spine into a makeshift fishing pole. His hands, face, and clothes were smeared with blood, as he stared intently while slowly jugging his fishing line. Jordan noticed Elliot and I were watching, and slowly turned with a blank emotionless expression pasted across his crusty sunburned face. "It bends." That's all he said before abruptly returning his focus back to the water. He had Norma's missing lower right leg across his lap. Isabel wouldn't stop screaming and thrashing. Kim and Oliver couldn't take it anymore, and wound up beating her into unconsciousness. I don't condone what they did, but damn it, someone had to shut that bitch up before she made things worse. Kim sliced his finger open during the altercation. It's been hours, and he's just holding it over the raft's edge. He's sitting alongside Jordan, just watching his blood slowly drip into the water. August 1st. Norma's body was finally disposed of, but it left behind a thick stench of rot and decay that you could practically taste. Isabel went into hysterics again, but was quickly silenced by Oliver and Kim. Oliver even started choking her this time. He had to be restrained by Elliot. Kim's wounded finger is infected. It looks really bad, but he doesn't seem to care. We finished our last pieces of meat from Norma's body. We're out of first aid supplies, and still have some water. Jordan kept Norma's lower right leg. He's cutting off pieces to use as bait. August 2nd. Kim cut off his infected finger. In one single motion, and didn't bat an eye. Kim did it so nonchalantly, and clearly didn't care who watched. Of course, it was Isabel's screams that drew all our attention. Isabel, that bitch. Weird to think that Isabel's shrieks bothered me more than Kim's act of self-dismemberment. That quickly changed after what Kim did next with his severed finger. He ate it. Peeled the skin and flesh right off its bone with his knife, and dropped the strips in his mouth. His hand bled profusely, but Kim paid it no mind. He twirled a narrow strip of flesh in between his lips. Kim stared at us maniacally as he loudly slurped it, like he was relishing our horrified reactions. The rest is illegible. August 4th. The raft is starting to deflate. Elliot and Oliver are trying to mend the leak, but I don't think it's working. Although he cut his finger off, Kim's hand still got infected. He's visibly sick, and hasn't said a word since yesterday. He's spent most of the past 24 hours curled in a ball on his side. Undated entry. I don't know what's happening. I'm so hungry. August 6th. We found something floating in the ocean today. It was a glass bottle. A yellow glass bottle. It was corked and held a single piece of paper, If we're even still alive. Still in the same reality. This has to be a dream. A vivid elongated dream. Maybe I'm still on the plane and it never even crashed. Maybe I never even got on that flight. That paper inside the bottle. All our names were written on it: Elliot, Jordan, Kim, Oliver, Isabel, and Rachel, myself. Next to each of our names was a 4-letter word. Elliot heat. Jordan hair. Kim pill. Oliver fire. Isabel room. Rachel dirt. Everyone grew eerily silent after reading that paper. Elliot crumpled and threw it across the raft. Nobody's looked each other in the eye. Isabel became hysterical. She kept asking how they knew before getting silenced by the others. I can't imagine what each of those words meant about the others in this raft. I can't fathom what it says about who these people really are as human beings. Maybe we're all stuck here, suffering like this for a reason. Maybe it's justified. For me though, I know exactly what that means. This is the first time I'm tangibly acknowledging that night. I'm probably going to die on this raft anyway, so what's the point of holding it in any longer? I always told myself it was an accident, but deep down I knew. I still see him every day when I leave for work and come home. Well, not literally, but we're always close. Let's just say he watches over my garden. August 8th. I saw it again last night. It was still dark, but I clearly made out its shape in the moonlight. That same figure I saw about 14 days earlier. Even in the darkness, I could see its gleaming pale yellow eyes, giving off that same discomforting aura. We exchanged stares for 2 or 3 seconds before it submerged. Dwelling on this is a lot better than watching what's happening in the raft. Kim. He's smiling. Cutting off and eating pieces of his own flesh. August 12th. The blood finally reached my side of the raft. I'm wallowing in it while writing these words. We were all so hungry. So hungry and weak, desperate for any means of nourishment. Jordan's fishing rod snapped in half. Incidentally, I think it happened while he was hooked on a fish. A look of unfettered rage spread across his face. I thought he was about to go on a violent rampage. I was certain it was over at that point. That's not necessarily what happened, but I was close. Instead, Jordan retreated into a corner, still clutching the severed spine. Jordan then looked at Kim, who was cutting off and eating pieces of his left forearm. He got down to the bone, even managed to cut around his veins. "You don't have to do it yourself," Jordan said in a low scratchy voice. Kim's eyes had a glazed primal look in them as he stared at Jordan. Kim looked terrifying, almost monstrous in appearance. Any patches of skin he hadn't gotten to yet were covered in sunburns, blisters, and giant sores. We all had scabs, burns, and blisters, but Kim, he didn't look human. Jordan and Kim mumbled back and forth to each other, their tones periodically spiking in excitement or anger. They started looking at Elliot. The same frenzied expression overtook both their faces. They kept exchanging incoherent murmurs, which was when I picked up a few words that Kim grumbled. "I'm so hungry." Elliot didn't stand a chance. He was fast asleep when Kim and Jordan pounced on him, sinking their teeth in Elliot's neck and shoulder. Elliot woke up instantly, and started making these awful, blood-curdling, high-pitched shrieks of helplessness, sheer agony, and incomprehensible fear. Elliot struggled, but looked sapped of any strength to put up a fight. Jordan and Kim tore off pieces of Elliot's flesh, spitting some out, while savagely chewing and swallowing other mouthfuls. All you could hear were Elliot's horrified agonizing screams, mixed with the sounds of ripping and crunching. I couldn't pull my eyes away from Kim, whose face was buried deep into Elliot's neck. Jordan furiously stabbed and sliced into Elliot's skin with the broken end of Norma's spine. He was literally ripping off pieces of Elliot by hand and stuffing them into his mouth. It felt like an eternity, but Elliot's screams eventually ceased. I'm not exactly sure when he actually died. After the screams stopped, Elliot's body violently twisted and convulsed for a few minutes, while Jordan and Kim continued devouring different parts of his body. Oliver had his face buried in his hands as this happened and whimpered quietly. Isabel laughed. August 14th. Elliot tastes better than Norma. August 15th. Oliver and Isabel vanished. I woke up this morning, and they were gone. Nowhere on the raft. They either fell overboard, or went in on their own. I can't come up with another explanation. I suppose you can't blame them. Maybe going back in the water was better than staying on this raft. Blood coats every surface, forming a thin, sticky, congealed layer that we're all sitting in, and aren't even phased. I can't even smell the decay. I'm probably used to it, at least that's what I keep saying. Jordan and Kim lash out whenever I try removing any of the blood, almost like they prefer admiring their skin and clothes. They decorated the raft, and themselves with Elliot's bones, entrails, and skin. August 19th. My pen ran out of ink, so I've been dipping the tip of my utensil in Elliot's blood to write. The raft started deflating again, and I honestly hope that every ounce of air escapes. Kim and Jordan are huddled together, jealously guarding Elliot's remains. They keep staring at me with ravenous eyes. I haven't slept in a few nights. If I let my guard down, well, look at what they did to Elliot. I can't keep this up much longer. I'm so tired. So weak. So hungry. The only strength I can muster is being used to write these words. I think I see something on the horizon. The rest of this page has been torn. Posted by NewAgeSolution. Always lock your doors at night. Most people who live in the suburbs probably have or still take their safety for granted. The mentality of thinking this will never happen to me or this only happens in other places is extremely prevalent as people live under the guise that their lives and communities will never be affected by the horrific stories you hear on the news about murders, kidnappings, and home invasions. I'll forever remember the night where I completely disconnected from this mindset and opened my eyes to how susceptible and unsuspecting we truly are in the comfort of our day-to-day lives. I was living in a quiet suburb about an hour away from New York City, renting a 2-story house. Around 4 in the afternoon on this particular day, I received a knock at the door. It was my neighbor Kimberly, who was referred to as Kim, and her 7-year-old son Kyle. "Looks like there was a mix-up in the mail," Kim said, smiling as she gestured down toward Kyle. Smiling enthusiastically, Kyle held out a light brown package about half the size of a shoebox. "Why, thank you very much, young man," I replied to the boy as I took the package, whose label had my name and address written. I couldn't help but smile at Kyle beaming so emphatically, who was clearly excited to have done such a good deed. "He insisted on bringing it over here himself when we realized it was yours," Kim said while scooping up Kyle in her arms. After graciously thanking them, I watched Kim walk back to her house next door, smiling warmly as Kyle waved at me over his mom's shoulder. I was particularly excited about this package, which was a sophisticated digital recorder I ordered online that would be extremely useful for my job, a multimedia editor. I took my package to the den, where I spent some time trying to set it up and sync it to my laptop. The process was more exhaustive than I anticipated, but I got the recorder in working order. Since it was the beginning of summer, it wasn't uncommon for me to leave my windows and back doors open for fresh air. The house I lived in had 2 glass sliding doors, one in the kitchen, another in the den, which also happened to be 2 of the 3 rooms I spent the most time in when home, the other being my office upstairs. I particularly remember this because after fiddling with the recorder, I laid on the couch and spaced out while listening to the breeze and rustling leaves outside, eventually drifting off to sleep. It was dark when I finally woke back up and a check of my phone revealed it was a little after 10 o'clock. I scowled sharply, knowing that being passed out for over 6 hours meant I wouldn't be able to pass back out at a reasonable time tonight. I spent the next few minutes turning on lights, shutting windows, and closing both sliding doors, noting a slight chill in the nighttime air. I just finished closing and locking the kitchen sliding door when I heard a soft thud come from the room directly above the kitchen, which was my office. Feeling compelled to investigate, I headed upstairs to my little office space, where I quickly spotted a large thick dictionary I frequently still use that had fallen on the floor next to my desk. I didn't think much of it, and seeing nothing else appeared out of place, I returned downstairs. While heading back to the living room, however, I froze upon noticing the lights were now off in the kitchen. While I didn't specifically recall shutting off the lights before heading upstairs, I rationalized it was possible I could have unconsciously flipped them off without realizing. I spent the next 15-20 minutes preparing some food before returning to the den. I had been eating for about 10 minutes when it hit me that my digital recorder was nowhere to be seen. I tried to refrain from panicking while surveying my immediate surroundings, checking if the recorder fell on the floor or around the coffee table. After thoroughly checking the couch cushions, under every piece of furniture in the den, and even in the kitchen, I decided to look in my office yet again, wondering if I somehow could have brought up and left the recorder in that room. Of course, I found nothing. I was more frustrated about my recorder missing than anything else, convinced it was still buried deep in my couch cushions and I simply didn't find it my first attempt. I decided to put off my search until I ate and watched the rest of my show. Another half hour passed, during which I finished my food and episode I was watching. I went to bring my dish and glass back into the kitchen and almost dropped them, becoming genuinely unnerved by what I saw. The lights were off again in the kitchen. I initially tried telling myself there might be an issue with the actual lighting, but saw the light switch was indeed flipped to its off position. While I distinctly remember leaving the lights on, I tried, but failed. To reassure myself, I managed to turn them off when exiting the kitchen with my food. I stood silently for about a minute, listening for any sounds of movement that might indicate I wasn't alone in the house. Despite the looming feeling of being watched that befell me, I warily switched the lights back on and placed the dirty dishes in the sink before speedily returning to the den, and explicitly noting the kitchen lights were left on before exiting. Despite feeling so unsettled, I tried forcing myself to relax and watch another episode of my show. Soon as I grabbed the remote, however, my stomach sank and heart started pounding frantically when the sounds of slow, deep, scratchy breathing filled the den. I shot up to my feet and anxiously scanned the room, trying to find the ominous noise's source. It took every ounce of willpower for me to not bolt out of the house, despite my state of fear magnifying with each slow raspy inhale and exhale that filled my ears. It initially sounded like the breathing came from all directions, until I caught a slight glimmer in the corner of my eye that drew my gaze toward the dense sliding door. My heart almost stopped upon realizing the door had been opened about halfway. The glimmer capturing my attention was the digital recorder, leaning against the screen door, which was emitting those ghastly breaths filling the room. Gasping as I started to tremble, this was more than enough for me to take my leave. I wasted zero time beelining toward my front door, but took no more than a handful of steps in its direction. That's when I saw who was inside the house, trying to torment me with these maddening mind games. I can still clearly visualize the person, or whatever it was, as I typed this account. It was noticeably tall, its head merely inches from touching the ceiling as it stood in front of the house's main entranceway. It was hairless, completely nude, and had tight leathery skin, being whitish beige in color with a sickly light grayish tint. The figure's head was small and round, almost having somewhat of an onion shape with two small beady black eyes. The being's most disturbing feature was its unnaturally wide smile that spread from ear to ear, brandishing its large, jagged, yellowish white teeth, and seemed to cover almost 1/3 of its face. It contained a sly, menacing expression, looking like it lavished over the fear its antics bestowed on me, and clenched what looked like a knife or narrow-pointed piece of rusty metal in its hand. We exchanged glances for about 10 seconds before panic completely overtook my train of thought, prompting me to shriek as I scrambled out of my house through the dense sliding door. Racing across my backyard, I hopped the fence and desperately pounded on Kim's back door, screaming for help and her to answer. I burst into Kim's house when she finally opened the door, tripping on her carpet and collapsing in a heap, screaming for her to call the police. While Kim made sure Kyle didn't see what was happening, it took her husband Barry a few minutes to calm me down and tell him there was an intruder in my house. Although he volunteered to go over to check himself, I repeatedly pleaded him to wait for the police. To my dismay, the house was empty when the cops arrived. The officers seemed to believe my story, and concluded whoever I saw probably fled after I ran out of the house. I must have had the officers check every inch of my residence 4 or 5 times over before I finally felt safe enough to return. The cops figured the intruder simply entered my house through one of the sliding doors that were open while I was asleep, noting how easily I could have been killed. "That's why we tell people, always lock your doors at night," one of the officers said before they departed, saying they'll file a report on the incident and reach out if there were any new developments or they had follow-up questions. Although Kim and Barry both said I could spend the night at their house, I politely declined. I did have Barry go through my house room by room with me once more before completely convincing myself nobody else was in the house, and agreed to check in with him the next morning. After making sure everything was locked, I tried calming down with a few glasses of wine and soaking in a hot bath. I managed to drift off for a little bit, unsure what time it was when I woke back up, since my phone was charging downstairs. While still unnerved by the night's previous events, I felt more at ease and comfortable enough to turn in for the night. After drying myself off, I was about to exit the bathroom, when a thunderous bang rang throughout my confines that caused the door I was less than a second from opening to jolt violently. I yelped and flinched back, pinning myself against the wall opposite of the doorway. A loud, deep, scraping sound filled the bathroom, sounding like someone was dragging something sharp and metallic across the door. My heart sank and stomach churned with a sharp queasiness when the scraping was followed by those same deep scratchy breaths I heard on the digital recorder, my limbs trembling uncontrollably while I curled into the fetal position. Who or whatever this is, was still in my house. It somehow eluded the police and thorough redundant searches that were conducted over every inch in my home. It was impossible to fathom that a wooden door was what separated this intruder from getting to me, while I was in such a vulnerable position and state of mind. My heart was beating and limbs were trembling uncontrollably, to the point where I fought to abstain from vomiting, all the while anticipating when the door would get broken down and that thing bursting into the bathroom. Those slow deep breaths only went on for a few more minutes before abruptly ceasing. Since I didn't hear the intruder physically walk away, I remained nestled in the space between my toilet and bathtub, keeping my eyes locked on the bathroom door, and too terrified to so much as utter a noise or move a muscle. I stayed this way for several hours, remembering when the sky started to lighten and the sun first shined its rays through the bathroom's tiny window. I refused to move from my spot until it was light enough where I could see under the crevice that nobody was standing in front of the doorway. Although this brought me some slight relief, I didn't venture out until I heard my cell phone start ringing downstairs. I armed myself with a small pair of scissors before slowly opening the door and peering out into the empty hallway. Nothing seemed out of place as I warily crept to my bedroom to get dressed. The alarm clock on my nightstand said it was a little after 11. My phone rang about 4 times before it finally stopped, which indicated someone had to reach me urgently. As I opened my closet to throw on a shirt, I dropped the hanger on the floor and bent down to pick it up, but wound up screaming and scrambled back from the closet. Propped up on the floor in a seated position, was a small human-shaped figure, covered in a light blue blanket that was tightly bound in twine and metal wiring. The sheet was covered with thick dark red stains, and a red puddle I ignorantly avoided identifying seeped out from the edges of this lump. The more I stared, the more distinct its human features became apparent through the blanket's outline. The body had another feature about it that I refused to acknowledge, but would become a grim reality when I heard a slew of pounding knocks at my front door. Without trying to regain my composure, I gradually headed downstairs to the main entranceway, making no effort to hide my face's unsettled distracted expression, while opening the door, which I noticed was now unlocked. Kim stood outside, whose tear-stained face contained an identically distraught expression of fear and panic. What she said next in her shaky broken voice through her sniffles and sobs is something I'll remember for the rest of my life, and clarified something about the discovery I made in my closet that I knew was inevitable. "Kyle's gone missing. We put him to bed last night, and haven't seen him anywhere all morning." Turns out it was Kim who was calling my phone, probably to see if I happened to know anything about their son's whereabouts. Her shrieks and howls are permanently embedded in my mind when they wheeled out Kyle from my house. I won't go into the gruesome details of how badly his body was mutilated, but will say they needed dental records to confirm this truly was in fact Kyle. I was expectedly arrested and immediately became a top suspect in Kyle's murder, but my account of what happened the previous night, along with a subsequent investigation, eventually cleared me of any wrongdoing. I'm pretty sure the intruder, or whatever I saw in my house, either briefly fled after I did, or retreated to some unknown hiding spot I'm not even aware the house contained. At some point, it killed Kyle and brought his body to my house before disappearing into the night. I try not to dwell about the specifics, but become deeply disturbed when thinking about Kyle's final moments, or how that horrid being also got into Kim and Barry's house. I don't know if its initial target was Kyle, or it merely used him as an accessory to exacerbate my affliction. All I know is the events from that night and following day have permanently scarred, and made me extraordinarily paranoid of my surroundings. Although I moved out of that house shortly after and never saw them again, I think about Kim and Barry often, unable to comprehend the pain they as parents must have and currently still endure from losing their child in such a grisly manner. I never saw or heard from who or whatever was in my house that night until now, which is what motivated me to finally write out my account. I returned home earlier this evening and found the digital recorder I received on that fateful day on my kitchen counter. I never came across the recorder after that night and ultimately forgot about it in my vain attempts to block out my traumatic experience. While inspecting it, I noticed there was a 3-second recording that I reluctantly played. Most of it was thick static, along with a deep scratchy voice, sounding like it came from the same thing or person who emitted those deep heavy breaths. The voice said one word, whose context I haven't deciphered, but greatly dread what it could actually mean. Here. Posted by NewAgeSolution. There's a dark truth connecting 3 1980s upstate New York murder cases. This comes from someone who claims to be a former forensic investigator that worked for a few precincts in upstate New York. To clarify, I have no personal ties to this person, don't know why they specifically reached out to me, or felt this page was their only remaining option to tell their story. I'm simply passing along what they said and will leave it to your own interpretation. After conducting my own research, however, I will say their theories are plausible and whoever this is, genuinely believes they've uncovered something heinous. Here's the account I received, told in their point of view. I worked as a forensic investigator in New York State's Delaware and Columbia counties. I've seen my fair share of crime scenes, from child suicides at ages they had no business of even entertaining such thoughts, to gruesome accidents and murder victims killed in the worst ways imaginable. There were 3 particular cases whose backstories compelled me to dig deeper, even after the official investigations concluded. What I found made me question the extents of reality, human depravity, and avarice. The first happened in East Chatham. December 1986. A teen, who I'll refer to as Will, murdered 4 of his family members, seeming to be driven by financial gain. All 4 bodies were discovered in their bedrooms, dying from gunshot wounds to the head. Despite being described as a shallow detached individual, Will excelled in school, and was thought to have a bright future. His family was very active in the community and owned a successful business, which made these murders especially stunning. The teen readily confessed when questioned, but wasn't very forthcoming on certain crime scene details. Dozens of candles placed on top of coins scattered around the house, inscriptions written in blood on the living room floor, most of which we couldn't document because they were repeatedly tracked over before we arrived, and the bodies all being smeared with an oily light green substance. The coroner reports on all 4 bodies described their wounds as narrow, bullet-shaped holes entering through the victim's forehead, and exiting through the back. The exit wounds looked nothing like those made by bullets, no casings or rounds were found, and tests for gunpowder residue were incidentally damaged at the lab by a pipe burst. While the official report said all 4 victims died from gunshots, it was technically never proven. Thinking they had sufficient evidence, detectives saw no need to investigate further after Will confessed, and overlooked these bizarre details. Although they determined Will, who claimed to have no recollection of that night, suffered a psychotic breakdown, I always suspected he had an ulterior motive. Any attempts at deciphering what was written on the living room floor were futile, except for one semi-legible phrase, Judoc. The light green slippery substance slathered on all 4 bodies was also identified as money oil, an herbal remedy used in witchcraft that supposedly brings prosperous wealth. Although many acknowledged there was a lot more going on, everyone ultimately wanted to move forward and minimize the attention East Chatham was receiving from this tragedy. In the end, I understood the desire to put this dark chapter of East Chatham's history behind us, and eventually accepted I wouldn't learn any more about what happened than what was already known. Fast forward a few years later, when I was working in Delaware County. The second case happened in June 1989, another mass murder that conjured up memories of East Chatham. A 23-year-old, I'll call Evan, murdered his family at their cabin outside Stamford. Lit candles placed on top of coins littered the home, where 4 bodies were found in the house's attic. Initially perceived as gunshots, the autopsy report explained their wounds as being bullet-shaped entrances that went completely through the victim's body. Unlike the East Chatham killings, these murder victims contained several deep perforations. The bodies were centered around a strange symbol that seemed to depict a blocky, crookedly drawn, uppercase B. A small backwards J protruded from the B's lower left corner, while a jagged uppercase D branched off its top left end. The emblem was drawn with a scorched powder that, based on samples recovered, had an initial light green color, and was composed of different herbs. It looked like Evan had been interrupted in the middle of whatever he was doing, prompting him to flee. He was cornered at an abandoned farm in a neighboring county, which ensued a lengthy standoff. Before being gunned down after opening fire on police, officers on scene recalled Evan kept screaming he was so close, needed to complete the circle, and finish the process. One bizarre piece of evidence was a black envelope Evan pinned on his family's business storefront sometime after committing the murders. It was covered in green wax and contained burnt remnants of paper that, from what few strands were salvaged, appeared to be some kind of letter or note. Although Evan apparently had severe mental issues, this dismissive explanation for his appalling actions disregarded some alarming details. Evan was apparently obsessed with money and wealth, to the point where it influenced him at a cognitive level. He stood to assume his entire family's estate, which, according to friends of his, Evan incessantly pondered about the liquid value of, and what he'd do with all that cash. When I disputed the investigation's conclusions, my police chief gave a familiar explanation. "Evan's dead," he said. "No need to allocate time and resources to an already solved case." Even after noting every similarity with the East Chatham murders, he wouldn't entertain any further inquiries, and eventually reassigned me to another division. It was after this I learned the powdery substance found in the attic was identified as money powder, which had many similar vegetal ingredients as its oleaginous counterpart, money oil. Despite violating orders and an abundance of department codes, I started my own secret investigation trying to connect these cases. There was too much overlap between them that I couldn't let this go without leaving no stone unturned. Both killings were committed by young men with financial motives. They murdered their families in near-identical manners. Candles placed on top of coins and substances made from the same materials were found at both crime scenes. Although I was convinced Will and Evan were trying to perform the same or closely related rituals, my evidence was circumstantial at best. I needed a direct link connecting them that would give my theory the credence necessary to be taken seriously. About a year into my independent probe, a case from February 1988 in Groveland, New York was brought to my attention. A man, I'll call Larry, murdered his whole family before committing suicide and setting their house on fire. After extinguishing the blaze, police discovered 5 bodies. Larry killed his wife and 3 children, who were each found lying in their beds. Although gunshots were officially deemed all 5 victims' causes of death, Larry was the only one described as being explicitly caused by a firearm. His wife and kids died from what the documents described as wounds closely resembling a gunshot that completely passed through the victim's cranial region. For me, there were 2 affirming details in this case that connected to the East Chatham and Stamford killings. Investigators determined the fire was started by lighting a charred black envelope. The note inside was too badly burned and no longer legible, but this envelope looked exactly like the one Evan pinned on his family's storefront. Larry also had a tattoo on his back matching the symbol found at the Stamford scene, a jagged B, with a smaller uppercase D and backwards J stemming from its corners. I also discovered Larry and his wife were having marital problems, which derived from a crippling financial situation that put them on the precipice of ruin. Finding this case led to more chilling discoveries. One regarded an owl rope bracelet with a gold wolf head charm Larry had on his wrist. Will wore the exact same bracelet when he was found, which I neglected to mention earlier. Despite living in Groveland when murdering his family, Larry settled there fairly recently, having lived most of his life in Shohair County. Not only did he own a business in East Chatham from 1983 to 1985 where Will happened to work for 8 months, but the abandoned farmhouse where Evan made his final stand was on land formerly owned by Larry's family. I delved further into Larry's background. Although information was hard to come by, it led me to learning about Lupus Verdes, meaning green wolf in Latin. What little I found described them as some kind of fraternal order, where Larry was a member. The only other details I uncovered about Lupus Verdes was they were formerly headquartered in a now abandoned lodge located somewhere between Medusa and South Westerlo, roughly the midway point between East Chatham and Stamford. The lodge burned down in the summer of 1989, after which the organization appeared to cease operations. The former lodge's dilapidated remains still stand today. I spent months trying to uncover more about Lupus Verdes, but had stagnant progress, and came to a barrage of dead ends. Shortly after, however, my rogue investigation was halted after being discovered by the DA's office. Although no charges were pressed, the police confiscated most of my documents and case files, after which I was swiftly terminated. A few years passed, when something seemingly out of the blue happened that dragged me back down this rabbit hole. I woke up one morning to find hundreds of papers, which came from a filing cabinet filled with old files I still had on these cases that the police somehow missed, littering the room where they were kept. Written on every one of those papers was a 6-letter word. Mammon. It was written in what appeared to be blood, and I initially neglected to mention the filing cabinet holding these old documents was in my bedroom. I couldn't let anyone know these files were still in my possession, so I took to the internet, where I gained a lot of perturbing insight on this word's meaning. Mammon was a theological demonic entity representing greed and want, who promised its worshippers boundless wealth. I almost fell over after first seeing Mammon's sigil, a distorted B with an uppercase D and backwards J jutting from its upper and lower left corners. It was the same symbol found in Will's attic and tattooed on Larry's back. This led me to read up on the different rituals for summoning Mammon. They varied in complexity and many involved using specific items like candles, coins, owl rope, herbal remedies, like money oil and powder, along with writing letters and requests to Mammon that you burn or place in black envelopes. I was especially bothered by a redundant detail of Mammon's appearance that was in quite a few visual depictions of the being. Many had Mammon brandishing a long narrow spike that retracted from its wrist, which was used to impale its victims' bodies. The stories I read said Mammon extract people's souls in this grisly manner, which were added to a collection it amassed over the millennia. It made me think about the wounds every one of those cases' murder victims had, which every report was quick to write off as gunshots. What else could create that type of opening? Were those poor souls truly at rest, or suffering a far worse fate? Mammon also apparently frequented the form of a wolf, which made sense of the fraternal order being named Lupus Verdes and those owl rope bracelets worn by Will and Larry having wolf head charms. I also don't think the dates all three massacres occurred were randomly chosen. Will killed his family on December 13th, when the feast of St. Judoc is held. Judoc, the word we found written at the East Chatham crime scene, was a young wealthy prince who gave up his opulence to become a priest. He lived a life of modesty, solitude, and was said to be a staunch adversary of Mammon, since he stood against everything the demon represented. Apparently, using blood to write names of you or your deity's antagonists is a form of mockery and scorn in occultism that supposedly appeases and empowers your idol. The Stamford murders happened on June 22, which falls on the summer solstice, whose signified period of growth is considered an opportune time to summon certain beings, and when the season of Mammon begins. Larry's murder-suicide occurred on February 28, 1988, which fell on a leap year. In the dark arts, leap years are supposed to provide a window for spirits and other beings to enter our world. It's worth mentioning many works I read about or mentioned Mammon described him coming in and out of our world using these leap year portals. Having presented my facts, I'll now tell you what I believe happened. Lupus Verdes was secretly a cult dedicated to Mammon, whose members sought wealth and prosperity. Some rituals for summoning this being, say flesh and blood offerings, yielded greater rewards, based on enormity. If done correctly and precisely. I suppose the magnitude of sacrificing one's family was thought to yield endless rewards from this being. Larry recruited Will and Evan, who became indoctrinated by the Order's teachings. My guess is Will failed to properly complete his ritual, causing him to undergo an irreversible mental breakdown. Evan appeared to have gotten interrupted while performing his, likely by police when they arrived at the house. Larry's situation was less clear. He was overcome with grief either for botching or coming to grips on what he was actually doing during his ritual, and ended his life in response. After how much publicity the Stamford killings got, Lupus Verdes probably decided to vacate the area or go underground, which could explain why their lodge burned. I expectedly made waves when trying to get my findings reviewed and investigate whether Lupus Verdes was still operating. I should have seen it coming, but anyone who even gave me the time of day dismissed my report, saying the evidence was too disputable, circumstantial, and, most insulting of all, inventive. I eventually gave up when my former precincts threatened me with legal action for not turning over all the files and documents I still had, who said I was rehashing settled business that had no need to be revisited. Things settled down for a while afterwards, until something that happened recently. I found a familiar-looking black envelope among some of my spouse's belongings, while clearing out a room that we were renovating. After reading the recently dated letter it contained, I now know I'm not safe in my home, and have been closely watched by people I've known and loved for years on behalf of a certain aforementioned organization. I don't know who to trust or where I'll go, but hope making my story known will help anyone that is, or suspects they're in a similar situation. This goes way deeper than expected, and those cases I used to put this puzzle together may only be the beginning of uncovering what other horrors this entity and its devout followers have committed.